General Bohr Komorowski later wrote in his memoirs,
"Once my wife Renia, with our child in the baby carriage, passed Senatorska Street, where an execution had just taken place. The corpses had already been carried away, but blood was splashed all over the pavement, and bits of brain were sticking to the walls. People were kneeling all around, and in a few seconds the whole place was covered with red and white flowers and burning candles. Flowers were put in every bullet hole in the wall. Renia stopped to pray. German police appeared, and she made off. When she looked back, they were shooting and beating people up. All in vain, for after a moment, the crowd was back again, and new flowers and new candles had appeared."
No i któregoś pięknego dnia przychodzi do mnie mały.
One beautiful day, my little son comes to me and says,
Wy nie macie
"You haven't got any weapons?" "We have, but not many." "And you're short of ammunition?" "We're short." "So why don't you have them?" I said, "My dear, because they don't sell them in the shops, and the Germans don't want to hand them over to us. But they can be found." "So, have you found any?" And at that, he puts his hands into his pockets and takes out 2 handfuls of rifle bullets. "Where did you get those from?" I dug them up.
Aufbau im Osten. Das Stickstoffwerk Moschice im Generalgouvernement wird wieder in Betrieb genommen.
despite the draconian discipline under which Poles worked in German-run industries, some Polish clerks and foremen managed to falsify their order books to divert essential materials to the home army. Nitrates for fertilizers were stolen to make explosives.
W 1942 roku postanowiliśmy uczcić imieniny Hitlera w sposób...
In 1942, we decided to celebrate Hitler's name day in a fitting manner. We falsified an order from the governor of the Warsaw district, Fischer, to all large factories working for the war industry. The workers were to be granted a special day off, for which they would receive full pay. We sent out the notices and distributed them in such a manner that they were received by the factories just before the end of the preceding workday, and therefore couldn't be annulled. Thus the factory directors announced, "Tomorrow you have the day off." Workers didn't clock in about 30 large factories. In Warsaw, in Pruszków, in Radom, about 40 factories didn't work. In Warsaw, the district governor appealed to the people on the streets through the public address system, saying that it was untrue, a forged document. Of course, that did no good. The workers didn't go to work, and several thousand, about 20,000, had a holiday for Hitler.
Newspapers, all controlled by the Nazis, became a target for minor sabotage by the Poles.
Scooters for Germans wishing to leave Poland for sale at Nazi Party headquarters. Jewish jewelry, guaranteed cleaned of blood. Rest homes for SS, Auschwitz, Dachau, Treblinka. Crematorium facilities available.
Ludność Warszawy, tak jak i innych okupowanych miast.
In Warsaw, the same as in other occupied towns, there was no proper theatre or anything. There were only those entertainments which the Germans wanted to give us. And the Germans wanted the worst possible. Vulgar, stupid, badly acted, you name it. And on top of that, the money went towards supplies for the German army. We diffused awful smells, garlicky smells. And of course, we spread the word that it was, well, poison gas, and so on. What didn't we do? Nothing helped. They went, and no doubt they'll always go in such conditions. We gave up the struggle over cinemas, because it was a waste of our time.
Campaigns against going to the movies formed part of what was called the Little Sabotage. It was a war of symbolism, an attempt to affirm a Polish identity in lawless and fearful times.
let us assume that 1 million Poles were organized in underground organizations. But 31 million did not belong to the underground. So I prepared the so-called Code of Behavior of Good Pole. And in order to secure the execution of this instruction, I organized approximately 10 underground courts, authorized even to pronounce death sentence. So mostly were those Poles who agreed to serve as a Gestapo agent were sentenced to death, then blackmailer. For instance, I gave special instruction that Poles who blackmail Jews, you know, in hiding, are to be sentenced to death too.
On June 22nd, 1941, Germany broke her alliance with the Soviet Union and invaded regions under Soviet control. Despite reports of a German military buildup, reports which had reached Moscow from the Polish underground by way of Britain, the Soviet Union was ill-prepared for the Nazi attack. As the Wehrmacht advanced rapidly, the Nazis believed they were near their long-term goal, the opening up of vast territories for German colonization. The Nazis planned to resettle up to 20 million Poles in Siberia. 3 or 4 million would be reclassified as Germans, and the rest exterminated.
Let the Poles never forget that they must blame themselves for their fate. They have no historical mission whatever in this part of the world. If they had such a mission, God would have blessed them.
So stated Governor Hans Frank. A pilot scheme was launched in November 1942. The populations of nearly 700 Polish villages in the Zamość district in eastern Poland were to be expelled and replaced by German settlers from Bessarabia on the Black Sea.
Nie spał, tylko tak.
No one slept. We were all on our guard. We could only see the flashes. Nearby, there was a place, Szparowa Góra, and the cars came from there. My father said expulsions were about to begin, to be sure. But at the very moment he was talking to my mother, there was a thud on the door to open up. My father went and opened the door, and the Germans hit him in the chest with a rifle butt.
Dojechaliśmy do Zamościa.
We arrived in Zamość. The gate was wide open for us. We entered there with all our possessions and went into a barrack. Children up to the age of 14, even those as young as 6 weeks, were taken away.
Nawet do 14 lat.
When these children were snatched away, and their mothers didn't want to hand them over, the Germans hit the parents. And then they started to hit the children, and they hit them really hard.
Także bardzo dużo dzieci, 3-letnią.
A lot of the children, even a 3-year-old girl, were thrown into the mud, even into the cesspit. They killed them. They took them by the legs and struck them against the corner of the barrack. And the mothers, after this, I suppose, were frightened that their children might come to greater harm with them. And the children were taken away and kept in other barracks. But gradually, they were taken away to Warsaw and Siedlce.
Pod Warszawę do Siedlc.
The plan was that children taken from their parents in Zamość were to be screened for desirable racial characteristics. Those showing evidence of Aryan blood were to be sent to the Reich for Germanization. In practice, most ended up in special children's concentration camps like the one in Lodz. Many died on the journey. Reports published in the Information Bulletin alerted the public to what was happening. and a number of the children were saved. Groups of Polish women waited for hours at railway stations to buy them back from the Nazi guards, but most were never seen again. The parents, meanwhile, were sent to the Reich or to concentration camps, many to Auschwitz.
Robi się szaro na dworze.
It grew light outside. There were whistles. We heard calls. It was for roll call. And we saw some kind of shadows emerge. Not people, inhuman forms in that light, shriveled, unlike people.
Niepodobne do ludzi.
For people not selected for the gas chambers, life expectancy in Auschwitz was approximately 3 months.
Obok bloku
Next to the block, there was a whole pile of bowls, but there were also various rags. And some of the bowls had been defecated in, as there was an epidemic and awful dysentery. People had diarrhea. Some of the women took bowls and wiped them because there was no means of washing, saying that they had to take some food. My mother asked me, should she take a bowl for my food? But I told her I didn't want any, and she didn't take one. We didn't eat anything on the first or the second day. But on the third day, we did.
I nas wszystkich na gusieńkę ustawili wzdłuż tych...
They lined us up stark naked along these cold stoves, which ran the length of the block. These brick stoves, which were rarely lit, completely cold. And we stood naked, and they made a selection according to who had this little triangle, part of a star. The Jewish women had a little triangle tattooed next to their number. And if you didn't have this, then raus, raus, back to those rats that were running around below. And in our presence, they put these Jewish women onto trucks and drove them to the death block. There was this death block. There were so many of them crowded there. They stood, sat, lay, that it was impossible to know how they all fitted in. Their groans could be heard through the little window. Sometimes a hand would stretch out, and when we passed, we would throw in some bread. You had to manage this so that the Germans didn't see you, because there was a severe punishment for that, for helping them. So we would secretly pass crusts of bread to the death block. We kept our spirits up in simple ways. We organized talks in the evenings. On the 12th of May, I prepared a commemoration of Piłsudski's death. I was in the Jewish block at the time. A small group gathered around me, and I spoke about who Piłsudski was, what he had done, and so on. All at once, a Jewish woman began reciting a poem about Piłsudski by Lekoń, beautifully.
In the rural districts of Poland, repression grew more intense as the occupation continued. Nazi demands for farm produce increased fourfold, and quotas were enforced with ever greater severity.
Brat 18 lat.
My 18-year-old brother, he hadn't done anything. I was a witness, because we grew up together. The Germans killed him, buried him alive. He wiped the sand out of his hair as the Germans were burying him.
The attempted colonization in the Zamość district provoked fierce reprisals from peasant battalions of the Home Army. Many peasants burned down their houses and killed their cattle rather than let them fall into the hands of the Nazis. The resettlement scheme was abandoned after the depopulation of 297 villages. In the early days of the occupation, many Poles had been induced to volunteer for work in the Reich as an escape from starvation at home. With the failure of Hitler's plan for quick victory in Russia, and with America now in the war, Germany's need for manpower increased dramatically. Now there were mass roundups in the streets of Polish cities. about 2.5 million Poles became part of a polyglot workforce. Slaves, prisoners, concentration camp inmates from all over Europe and the Soviet Union. On them, the Nazi war economy became progressively more dependent. The unreliability of forced labor, whether because of slow work or outright sabotage, hindered the German war effort. As the roundups continued, more and more people fled the cities to take up arms with partisan groups in the countryside. By late 1943, as the occupation dragged on into its 5th year, large areas of rural Poland were in the hands of partisan and outlaw groups, all struggling to live off the resources of the peasantry. There were hundreds of thousands of resistance fighters in the Home Army and the Allied peasant battalions. Other smaller groups fought independent actions. Communist partisans, the People's Guard, were a tenth the size of the Home Army's coalition. The right-wing NSZ sometimes fought against the Home Army itself and were frequently responsible for the killings of communists and of Jews fleeing genocide. But most of the resistance was now under the operational command of the Home Army.
There was a saying that spring is coming, Germans are running away. Of course, not all stories were true, but I think the Stalingrad was the turning point. And then that winter, when we saw ever so often, especially by night, trains coming from the Eastern Front full of wounded soldiers, gradually it became more and more apparent.
The wind blows over time. Is this love? Life? The flakes of their eyes? The flakes of the storm? Sand, do you remember? Earth, do you remember? The gun strap cutting into the arm. Faces, uniforms like sacred ash. Remember the grandsons? The hour of light?
Early in 1944, the Red Army's advance brought some of its units across the pre-war Polish-Soviet frontier. It was obvious by now that Poland would be liberated by the Red Army without the participation of the West. The questions of Soviet intentions toward former Polish territories began to dominate the thinking of the resistance leaders. Soviet partisans were already being parachuted into areas where Home Army units were active.
The people, of course, didn't like the Russians. And, of course, the units, whatever they were called, bands or partisans, they didn't trust them because they were led by these same people who in 1940 and in 1941 were responsible for the mass deportation of people to Russia.
From London, the military command of the government in exile issued its order. Unless political agreement could be reached with Moscow on the question of Poland's eastern frontiers, the Home Army should remain in hiding and be ready to continue underground activity in the event of a Soviet takeover. But the Home Army commanders in Poland considered this unrealistic. They devised instead the plan, Operation Tempest. The Home Army would demonstrate its legitimacy and that of the government in exile by cooperating fully and openly with the incoming Soviet forces.
We wanted to come forward as hosts of this land on which we lived and on which we'd fought throughout the whole period of the German occupation.
Throughout March and April 1944, there were many attempts at joint action with the Soviets. Sometimes relations with the Red Army commanders were good. But news began to reach Warsaw of the arrest of Home Army officers by the Soviet security forces and of the forcible merging of their detachments into the Red Army. In July, when the German Eastern Front collapsed before an overwhelming Soviet offensive, the Home Army Command revised their strategy for Operation Tempest. They abandoned piecemeal action. Before the Soviet Army could arrive, the Home Army concentrated its forces on the first major city which Poles claimed as their own, Wilno.
The organization of an attack on Vilna by the Home Army detachments was incredibly difficult because the detachments could not be combined outside Vilna. There was a mass of retreating German troops, very well equipped, of course, a mass of heavy armaments of every kind, planes, whereas we were poorly armed detachments. It wasn't only the Vilna region that was to take part in the action, but also the Novogrudek region, under the same command, Commander Wilk. The distances were such that the detachments in the north were up to 130 kilometers away, so this was a huge area.
We actually didn't have much contact with our superiors. We didn't have radio station, and actually the contact was only practically once a month. And sometime in June, I sent my second in command to the higher authority to get the new instruction, and he learned there that we supposed to go to Vilna. But he stressed, at the same time, we won't be able to go to Vilna because there were very strong German point, of this road to Vilna.
It was calculated that there would be about 15,000 to attack Vilna. News reached us that the detachments coming down from the north, Węgielnes, were a very large, very powerful group, made up of several of those partisan detachments that were experienced in combat. And they, together with the Russians, entered the city and captured the district on the other side of the river.
To the checkered history of the ancient city of Vilna is added yet another dramatic page as the Red Army liberates it from German occupation. These are official Soviet pictures taken when the Germans in this sector were liquidated. The Russian Third Army, continuing its attack, tightens an iron ring around Vilna.
News reached us that the Polish flag was already flying, that Polish police were there, the Polish administration, that the district had come, so to speak, into Polish possession.
When the Red Army moved in, Wilno was largely in Polish hands, but the Soviets had other plans for it.
Mass arrests began to take place. I was arrested on the 15th of October. And what's interesting was the sentence. I was sentenced for having worked in the underground during the German occupation against the Germans. The implication was that I wanted to take away part of the Soviet Union's territory for Poland. Well, afterwards, I frequently asked, I'm sorry, but why was I charged with betrayal of the homeland? The paragraph was betrayal of the homeland. After all, which homeland? I didn't betray Poland by working against the Germans.
The failure of Operation Tempest left the Poles only one last chance to assert their national identity and sovereignty. As Soviet forces approached, the Home Army decided to rise up against the Germans and liberate Warsaw. This attempt, as logical as it was foolhardy, was the crowning gesture of the Polish resistance. On the 1st of August, 1944, the uprising began. It was the most heroic and by far the bloodiest urban insurrection Europe has ever seen. It would lead, after 63 days of fighting, to the total destruction of Warsaw by the Nazis.
simply give the sort of instruction to the people. If you find a place somewhere in the village, when you feel that you will be welcome in this village, you can stay. I give you this sort of release note from the army and you can stay. So by the end of December, out of this my unit, which was pretty strong, there was only 16, actually 17 left. And we fought until the 16th of January 1945.
Poland's attempts to win its own freedom on the battlefield went down to defeat in the ashes of the Warsaw Insurrection. But Poland as a nation would survive. When Britain and France had declared war against Germany in 1939, crowds had gathered at the British and French embassies in Warsaw to sing God Save the Queen and the Marseillaise. Many Poles had expected the arrival of Allied armies to fight back the German invasion. They couldn't have been more wrong. 5 years passed before any troops arrived. And the army that finally did come was the Red Army from the Soviet Union. It was typical. Poland had always felt spiritually drawn toward the democracies of Western Europe, and had always looked to them for assistance in winning its own independence. But Poland could not escape the shadow of Russian and German power. France, Britain, and the United States might represent the dream, but Germany and Russia were the hard and dominating realities.